Buenos días. Good morning. Bom dia, meus irmãos e irmãs. As we were singing today, I need you to survive. And I am absolutely certain that I need you to survive. I need you to survive because you are the lifeblood from which I live. I need the United Methodist to survive because it was the womb in which I was formed, and that has nurtured me through all these 80 years. And I especially need the young people who are here, because us old people, our dreams will only survive as you pick them up. So I need you to survive. And I'm so glad that you are the people whom I depend to survive. I want to add a footnote, though, to that. Something that I have not heard here, and something I'm pained that I don't hear more often in gatherings of the United Methodist Church, is that the United Methodist Church needs the whole Church of God to survive. Latino-Latina issues are not just United Methodist issues. Justice and immigration issues are not just United Methodist issues. And if we think that we, the United Methodists, are the only instrument that God is using to bring about justice and peace and reconciliation, we are wrong. We need the church to survive. And I want to begin by saying that. Then I want to congratulate the people who have organized these days. It has been fantastic days. I don't have to tell you how fantastic the speakers have been. I have been moved by all of them. I have found myself strengthened and challenged by all of them. You will hear some echoes on some of the things that I have heard, that we have heard in what I have to say today. I was thinking when Bishop Carcaño, whom I have known for many, many years, was speaking, that she was saying what I was thinking, one thing that I was thinking about saying here, but I don't have to say it anymore. And that is that the United Methodist Church have organized itself in such a classist way that most Latinas and Latinos cannot afford to be United Methodists. And we either reorganize that, or we shall all be accountable before God. I was also moved by many expressions that we had of immigration and the issues of immigration. But I think we ought to have a global view of things. Every immigrant is also an immigrant. And if people decide to leave their native lands, the lands that they love, it is because of things that are happening in those lands to which our nation is connected. And to deal with immigration just from this side as if the whole world began at the border is not enough. And that's part of, I'm proud that the United Methodist Church has always seen that, and that the World Global Ministries has always understood its mission in that way. Now, it is customary to begin a speech such as this by saying that one is pleased to be here. Well, since, as Fernando just said, 3 days ago I entered my 9th decade, I just said I'm pleased to be, period. But really, I am pleased to be here because I need you to survive. But I am also baffled. Why am I here? I am baffled because there are many others here who could speak on this subject much better than I could, and with much more experience than I have. There are some of you here who were part of the leadership of Marcha when the plan was nothing but a distant dream. I was not. There are some of you here who were part of the original committee that crafted the national plan. I was not. I was brought in as a latecomer to draft the results of your recommendations. There are some of you here who have been members or are members of the National Committee. I have not been, and I am not. There are some of you here who have written the modules for the national plan. I have not. There are some of you here who have been part of the national staff and others who coordinate work on the annual conferences. I have not been, and I am not. There are some here of you who hold positions of responsibility in the church, the structures of the church, and in whose hands much of the future of the shaping of the church is. I am not one of you. So, I am baffled. Why am I here? What baffles me further is that I am a historian. And a historian is asked to speak about the future. After all, historians are supposed to be looking at the past, to be backward looking. As the famous dictum says, history is prophecy turned backwards. It's quite easy to foretell the past. So I have a nice job, just foretell the past. Figure out what happened. But then that gives me a hint as to why I am here and invited to speak to you about the future. You see, I have often said that history is not written from the past. History is written from the present in which a historian lives and the future for which a historian hopes or which a historian fears. So I take it that I could say then also that prophecy is history turned forward. And so I take it that although I'm invited to speak to you today about the future, I am to look at that as a historian. And as such, what I intend to do is to take as my starting point, as we speak today about this 25th anniversary of the National Plan, the 46 years of Marcha, to speak about what might be the next 25th anniversary that will take place 25 years from now. As future historians look at the past, at us, look at their past, which is now our present. And I think about those terms, there's a future that I fear and a future for which I hope. First, the future that I fear. In that not too distant future, 25 years from now, the year 2042, I see a group of United Methodist historians looking back at those earlier decades of the 21st century and remarking that it was a time of division, not only within the United Methodist Church, but also in the country as a whole. It was a time when the nation had to make important decisions about its future and its place in the world. Will it be a nation that will confuse being great with being a worldwide bully? Or will it be a nation that will seek to become great by being a beacon of justice and freedom and welcoming the stranger? In that future, which I fear, those historians will look back at our present and say that we, like the nation, were a church divided. On the one hand, we made all these forward-looking and enlightened declarations about welcoming the stranger, of justice for the poor, on the equality of all God's children, on care for the earth. But on the other hand, looking back at today's political scene, those historians will also note that it was generally in the very areas of the nation where the United Methodist tradition was stronger where it had had the best opportunity to impact politics and public opinions, that this was precisely the areas that were still the strongholds of xenophobia, of racism, of homophobia, of disregard for the rights of the earth, and of idolatric nationalism. In that future, which I fear those historians will look back upon our day and say that in that fateful second decade of the 21st century, when the United States had the last opportunity, the United Methodist Church had the last opportunity to explore different directions, it simply continued on the same path. Or rather, perhaps, along the same two paths. Some affirming the higher values of the gospel of love and justice, and others reducing the gospel to a message of individual salvation and staying away as much as possible from relating it to crucial decisions that the nation had to make. Those historians will say that this was understandable, for after all, it was the same in all the so-called mainline churches. And let me just make a footnote about that. In a nation in which more and more people are being marginalized, there may be an intrinsic contradiction into calling yourself a mainline and a Christian church. It was justified because, after all, that was the same thing that was happening in all the mainland churches. And perhaps, as a final nail in the coffin, they will also say that in those faithful decades of the United Methodist Church had taken the leadership among mainline nations in responding to the challenge of ethnic minorities, which is true. But that those minorities were also divided between those who followed the high road of their denomination's pronouncements and those who allowed themselves, by those who let themselves be carried by the ethos of the nation. Remember what we heard yesterday about our own prejudice. Prejudice is not just out there. It's also our prejudice. Okay. Now, so that is the future the future that I fear. But then there's another possible future for which I hope. In that future, 25 years from now, in that same year, 2042, those same historians will look at the present situation and see the same issues, the same divisions, but a different response. They will look at the last years of this decade and the early years of the next and say that at a time when the nation was becoming increasingly divided and violent, the United Methodist Church began by acknowledging the deep division within its own ranks and made a priority to deal with that division and to heal that division. Not by means of easy compromise, not by means of a power struggle to see who gets more votes in General Conference, but by means of genuine communication. Remember what you heard yesterday about communication and prejudice. They will look upon our time, those historians will look upon our time and say that just as in the last decades of that 20th century and the beginning of the 21st, the United Methodist Church took the lead among main Protestant churches in responding to the increasing ethnic diversity of the nation. In the early decades of the 21st century, it also took the lead in responding to the deep divisions within its own ranks, and to do so in a different way. And so, now, they will say now, as we gather to celebrate the 50th anniversary of what was originally called the National Plan for Hispanic Ministries, who knows what it would be called then, but as they gather to celebrate the 50th anniversary, they will say, we rejoice that the United Methodist Church can claim that it is truly united and that its united witness has made a significant contribution to the healing of the nations. Nations. And we rejoice, and they will also rejoice. They will also say, in that this United Methodist Church has also been truly Methodist, proving that it is true heir of that founder who led the way in the struggle against colonialism in India and against slavery throughout the world, and who declared that these 13 colonies had no claim on freedom as long as they held to slavery, which we often forget. That is the future for which I hope. But then we come to the crucial question: how to get from here to there? And given the context in which we are today, what is the role of the National Plan for Hispanic Latino Ministry and of Marcha in that path that will take us from here to there? Perhaps, first of all, before we move much further, and in this, I'm speaking about something that I find very difficult to do myself, and I remember what we were told yesterday about our prejudice. First of all, we have to work at communication. We need to understand the feelings and the fears of those who have difficulties with our vision and our proclamations. We need to understand the sentiments and the fears of the United Methodist co-worker in West Virginia, who feels that his livelihood and his family are threatened by theories and explanations about global warming that he cannot understand. We need to understand the pain of an elderly woman who's sitting in a pew of the church where she was baptized, where her parents were married, whose grandparents are in the windows, and now sees a church full of people that she herself cannot understand. We need to understand the bewilderment of a sharecropper in North Carolina who was told, as we have been told various times, that there was something right about him because, after all, he was white. And that was his one claim to being somebody. And now goes to the supermarket and hears all kinds of languages that he cannot understand. Now, unless we understand these things and take them into account and respond to them with love and respect and firmness, our declarations will fall on deaf ears, and our best intentions will be brought to naught. And the same thing that happened in the last election, that the people in the states that have been supposedly most influenced by the United Methodist Church are the same people who voted against the main principles of the United Methodist Church, will happen again. Secondly, we must make certain and make clear to all that our social and political positions are not simply a taking side between political parties. We may have to do that, but that's not what our positions are about. They are matters that come out of the very nature of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And therefore, we are more conservative than people who are trying to conserve a supposed past that never existed 60 years ago. We are more conservative because we conserve the earth that God gave us much more than 60 years ago. We are more conservative because we are about that word of God that was in the beginning, through whom all things were made. And we are also more radical than the most extreme left. We are more radical because we do what they do too. We fight for the rights of the poor. We fight for universal health care. We fight for the end of all discrimination on the basis of race, culture, sexual orientation, or whatever. We fight for a nation that will receive the poor and the persecuted and the wretched of the earth with open arms. Such issues certainly should be reflected in all our political decisions. But we do not do that out of support of a particular political party. We do that because we are radical enough to believe that the time will come when God will judge among the many nations. That the time will come when they shall beat their spears into plowshares and the swords into plowshares and the spears into pruning hooks. That the time will come when they shall sit each under their own fig tree and each under their own vine. That the time will come when no one shall make them afraid. That the time will come when they will come from the east and the west and the north and the south and sit together at the table of God. Or as you want to put it this way, that the time will come when the vision of John will be also our vision in which we all partake. Behold, I saw a great multitude that nobody could count, from every tribe and people and nation and language. And because we believe these things, we have to be more radical than the radical left. The question then is, how do we share this faith and this vision with the people called Methodists? How do we share it with that coal miner in West Virginia, with that elderly woman who feels that her church is being taken away from her, with that sharecropper in North Carolina? How do we share it with the people called Methodists, who are Democrats and Republicans and independents? How do we share it with the people called Methodists, who are natives and immigrants and nativists? How do we share it with the people called Methodists, who speak English and Spanish and Korean and Swahili and Arabic? How do we proclaim the gospel that calls us all to true radical dependence and a reordering of our priorities? We may lobby General Conference for resolutions that affirm justice and equality and love. We must do so. But that is not enough. We may set aside funds to support the poor and the elderly and for combating prejudice and injustice. We must do so. We have to do that. But it is not enough. We may produce educational materials to put forth these matters. We must do so. But it is not enough. We must seek legislation that rights the wrongs of our society. Wrongs having to do with all the things that we heard about and many that we have not even heard about. We must do that. Yes, we must. But that is not enough. What we need is to acknowledge and confess that we have failed to communicate the full meaning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, not just to the world at large, but to the people called Methodists. That is why when our bishops call us to welcome the stranger, Methodists feel free not to listen. That is why when General Conference allows funds for justice of issues, for the liberation of the oppressed, for support of immigrants, for the National Plan for Hispanic Latino Ministry, there are quite a few among the people called Methodists who resent that their money is being used to those ends. We have failed to communicate a gospel that is all-encompassing, that goes beyond the matter of my salvation, that compels people to become involved in issues of justice and equality. And now that failure has many causes, and many of them are justifiable to human eyes, but whatever the reason, we shall be accountable before God Almighty. And I'm not talking about we, the people we don't like. I'm talking about we, you, the people without whom I cannot survive. We shall all be accountable before God Almighty. Now, what does all this have to do with the National Plan for Hispanic Latino Ministries? It has much to do with it. Because our own Hispanic Latino ministry, our own Hispanic Latino Latina community is a microcosm in which we see these issues. If we take them into account, and if we find viable responses, it may well be, I am sure it will be, that the national plan will have an impact beyond the Hispanic Latino community and will be an instrument, an important instrument God will use for the renewal of this United Methodist Church and moving it into God's future. An instrument that God will use to make sure that those historians who gather in a place like this in the year 2042 to speak about our 50th anniversary will not be living in that future which I fear. Since those who invited me to come to be here suggested that I emphasize the matter of leadership, education, and formation, and that's a matter, obviously, as Fernando and Michael have said, that has always been of importance to me, I suggest that this morning I center our attention in leadership formation. I suggest that not only because I have been so instructed, but also because leadership formation is a focal point in which the Hispanic Latino Ministry United Methodist Church is a microcosm of the church at large, and even one in which some of those features are exaggerated. Needless to say, if the national plan is to succeed, we need capable leaders at every level. And I'm so encouraged to see you all here, especially the people whose hair is far from being white like mine is. The people whose stomach is still flat. I am so encouraged. I'm so encouraged to seeing you here. Because you are God's response to the need of the United Methodist Church. Now, the national plan has done many, many important things, and we have all read the report. It has worked with the General Board of Higher Education and Ministry to strengthen and support the course of study programs, to provide financial aid for some of their participants. It has designed and implemented theological education programs and curricula for lay persons, for lay missionaries, for lay ministers. It has collaborated in the production of various materials, educational materials for different audiences, including children and pastors. It has produced, updated, and managed the use of the series of modules with significant success. It has developed virtual means with which to provide information to serve as a place for discussion and inquiry, and it has done much, much, much more than that. You know better than I do because you have been doing. But still, we must acknowledge that there are serious problems in connection with the recruitment, training, supervision of Hispanic, Latino, Latina leaders. As I move throughout the connection, I find numerous cases, just one would be too many, but far too numerous cases of people who have been assigned the role of pastors simply because they spoke Spanish. My brothers, my sisters, that's another form of racism. Yeah? Yeah. We need trained pastors. But these folk, anybody who happens to speak Spanish, that's okay. And you know the tragedies that come out of that. That's another form of racism. And it's racism, not on our supposedly more conservative ground. It's racism on the part of our district superintendents who are doing that. Fortunately, I'm already retired. Now, where that has been the case, when that is the kind of leadership that our church thinks that our people need, we should not be surprised when our people take the positions that they take. When our people have the limited understanding of the gospel that they have. When our people believe that the gospel is simply a matter of my relationship with God and my salvation and my singing hymns. Then another way of recruiting leadership is to bring them from abroad. And that's good. But again, don't take for granted that because a person already knows how to be a leader in another place, they know how to be a leader here. Let me tell you a story. Some years ago, I was doing some study on Latino theological education all over the country on an ecumenical basis. And I was talking to a leader of the church and a supervisor, a bishop of another district denomination. And he said, I don't know what's the matter with Father so-and-so. Back in his country, in El Salvador, I was told that he was a great leader, a great pastor. And now he's serving here. And he's lazy. He doesn't do anything. That evening I went and was talking to the pastor. And he says, I don't know what to do. Mine was from a village of 500-600 people, and he was living in the Bronx. I said, I don't know what to do. The first day I went out on the street, there were a bunch of teenagers on the sidewalk, and they started accosting me, and one pulled out a knife, and now I don't dare go out on the street. Nobody had trained him. Nobody had told him what the Bronx is like. They simply thought that because he was a great pastor in another situation, in a village, and because he had got good work there, he could do it here. And not paying attention to those matters is also another form of racism. And then we come to the course of studies. Our Latino leadership has done a great deal to improve the course of studies. There's still much more to do. The course of studies was originally designed for people who have spent their whole life in the Methodist, at that time was the Methodist, not the United, but the Methodist Church, and who then at a later time in life received a call to ministry and then were trained to do that. It was not designed for people who did not know what United Methodism was all about. Huh? In one of those course of studies, I met a young man who told me that he had been a Presbyterian, but when he came from Mexico, he decided to become a Methodist, and the reason why he was a Methodist was that the Presbyterians drank. Now, if we don't have a program to help that man understand what the issues, the real issues are, and what the United Methodist Church is about, and the full gospel is about, then don't blame him. Don't blame him because his people don't get involved in issues of justice and peace and solidarity. It is our fault that simply to fill a pulpit we do that without going through the necessary steps. And the situation is not much better in seminaries. Okay? Okay? Since we have had some statistics, I'm going to give you just one, and that's just one. In all the seminaries in the U.S., Catholic and Protestant, the total Latino-Latina student population is a little bit less than 4%. Now you're talking about almost 20% of the population, most of whom are Christians of some sort, and that population of 20% is represented by 4%. And the representation of faculty is slightly less than 4%. Now, again, another story. Some years ago, in that same study, I met another pastor who told me, I went to seminary. I was full of questions. And the first semester I was there, I was told in many ways that those were not the right questions. And then, second semester, I spent learning the right questions. And I spent the rest of my time in the seminary asking the right questions. And now that I have been for 5 years in the parish, I discover that my original questions were the right questions after all. And he said, what a waste. What a waste. Although not exactly in the same words, I hear the same comment in many minority contexts and clearly Latino-Latina contexts. And then we are surprised, and then we also in theological education are bothered by our preachers don't preach what we taught them, that they don't study the Bible the way we told them to study it, that they don't do things the way we told them to do it. Yeah. I better not get going. Now, I know that I'm exaggerating, no? I've not said enough, but I've also said in some ways too much, because there's another dimension. We all know it. I mean, there are the whole experience of theological education is much more varied than that. In all of us, we are here because at some point, those of us who went to seminary, at some point we had some mentor, somebody who in the midst of everybody else saw us and worked with us and saw who we were and understood our questions. I tried to listen to our questions, so this situation is not that bad. But it's still real. Now, having said that completely, let me go now back to the original issue of how to communicate to the church at large a fuller vision of the gospel of Jesus Christ, a vision that includes, yes, a very deep root in personal faith, personal commitment, prayer, the hope of salvation. And that includes also, and at an equal level of importance, the vision of the apostles and prophets, that the time will come when God will judge among the nations, when they shall beat the swords into plowshares, and they shall sit under their own vines, under their own fig trees, and no one shall make them afraid. Now, how do we communicate that? How do we communicate this vision and the joy of it to the church at large and to the world? I submit to you that one way of doing this is to take up part of what the National Hispanic Plan has been doing, and to take it a step further by exploring the significance of the experience of the plan for the church at large, and particularly for the formation of leadership, because that's what I was asked to speak about, the formation of leadership for a church that needs to restore broken bridges of communication. In its quadrennial in its report to General Conference, and you have all read it, and you have a summary of it, the plan focuses on 4 essential aspects of the work. 1, leadership development, that's what I was told to talk about. 2, accompanying annual conferences and developing local church strategies. 3, developing new congregations. And 4, working on immigration and other social justice issues. Now, as we read that plan and as we see the people who are working on it, it is clear that these 4 elements are not to be understood as a list of different concerns. As a sort of checklist, we have to do this, we have to do that, we have to do that. But rather as 4 facets of a holistic strategy centered in the development of a leadership that is capable of carrying forth the other 3. And therefore, also of bridging that communication gap that threatens the very unity of the church and hampers its mission. And that vision, it is not simply a matter of training first leaders and then sending them out to accompany annual conferences, to develop new congregations, to work on immigration and social concerns. It is rather a matter of leaders who are developed in the process of accompanying annual conferences, developed in the process of creating and building new congregations, developed in the process of dealing with immigration and other social issues. It's not a matter of first you learn all the theory and then you go do it. It's a matter of you learn, you do, you learn, you do at the same time. What this means and what the national plan is leading the whole church to do is to reconstruct the entire formation of our leadership in a radically new way that will require changes not only in the curriculum, I should say curricula, because I include there the course of studies, I include there the seminaries, I include the lay training, whatever it is. Radical changes of the curricula and also in our own pedagogical understanding and pedagogical practice. How do we understand the task of teaching, of training, preparing people? And we are all about that. I'm not talking just to professors. We are all about that. If we are in ministry, we are all in that. And in brief, this means that we may begin not by asking what those whom we are training need to know. That's important. But rather, what they need to teach and how to teach it. What I am suggesting is that if we begin to understand leadership developing in a fuller sense, and to use it as we look at the future, those of us who are engaged in any way in planning and administering and teaching leadership, formation, and education, we must no longer think that the final recipients, the object of theological education, the object of leadership formation, are our students or are those prospective leaders, be it in seminary, in the course of studies, or wherever. The final goal of theological education is to equip the people of God for the mission of God. The real cutting edge of theological education is not, and same thing about leadership training, is not in my study, is not in my office or in my classroom. It is not even, as I am very hesitant to say, in my latest book. The cutting edge of theological education is in the thousands of communities of faith where the people of God learn and practice the faith in order to go forth in the mission of God. The main reason why our students are in seminary or in workshops or in course of studies or in graduate school or whatever is not to learn more, but to be better teachers, better leaders, both as content as methodology. Now, don't understand me wrong. I think learning is very important. Otherwise, we risk being those that, 16 centuries ago, Leo the Great said that they were teachers of error because they had never been disciples of truth. And we have many teachers of error today who have never been disciples of truth. So learning is also important. Okay? But yet we must learn that the reason for our learning is to teach. Our students must learn, yes, but the reason for their learning is so they can teach. And every church member must learn, yes, but the reason for their learning is that they can communicate the faith and teach it to others. Now, were the national plan and its experiences able to convince the United Methodist Church that this is the way to go in leadership development, it will radically change all our leadership training from top to bottom and the criteria by which we evaluate the success of those programs. Allow me to explain something like this with a brief autobiographical note. Beginning at elementary school, I was very fortunate because we were poor, but my mother happened to be the principal of one of the best schools in Havana. And so my brother and I were for free. And from there to Yale University, I am grateful for having received the best possible education. But today, as I look back at it, I realize that that great education was also a terrible education. Back when I was in third grade, I learned all the punctuation marks and how to use them, columns and semicolons and dashes and all that kind of stuff. And I wrote a paper for my teacher that included all those things. The first page was one long sentence. And she looked at it and she said, "Wow, that's so good." And she praised me for that. And ever since then, I was taught to write and to work, not to communicate, but to impress those above me. And the top of that was when I wrote the dissertation, spent a whole year doing it, and it was a thing this big, to impress 3 people. And I hope nobody ever read it beyond those 3 people. Now, when you look at it that way, in society in general, we have organized education as if it were a ladder with very steep steps. And the way you move along that ladder is by impressing those above you sufficiently that they help you and pull you up to the next step. And then, when you get to the top, you are through and you are king of the mountain. Now, I know that I'm exaggerating. That's not the true picture. I said before that that's not. I know that it's a caricature, but caricatures tell something that's true, Nobody can have the kind of hair that Trump has in his cartoons, right? But it's sure that he doesn't have a crew cut. Nobody can have the teeth that Jimmy Carter has. But when you see him, you recognize him because he's stressing a characteristic. So caricatures tell the truth. They tell the truth by emphasizing important elements. So I know that this is a caricature, but please, behind that caricature, listen to the truth that's behind it. If it is true that the intended recipient of theological education is the church at large, and not the individuals who are receiving it, that the intended recipient of leadership training and formation is the church at large and not the people who are receiving it. What is important is not just what the person learns, but also, and most importantly, how he or she is able to communicate that to the church at large and to make it relevant to the church at large. Okay? If what is important is that students learn so they can move up into the next step in that pyramid, we will evaluate their work on the basis of how much they know, how they reflect on it, how creative and original their papers are. But if our goal is not simply that students learn, but also, and most importantly, that they take part in the theological education, you want to put it another way, the full gospel education, okay, of the entire church, then we must find ways to evaluate the students, the studies that go beyond exams, and whose purpose is not to find out how much they know and how good their research and the reflection is, but rather their ability to move others along the same lines. And let me tell you, this is not limited to practical fields. In seminaries, one of those things that we do, I say they, no, we do, is do things in sections, and then there is a final section they call practical theology, which may be a confession that the rest of theology is not practical. I don't mean just those fields. I mean everything that you learn. If it's worth learning, it's worth teaching. If it's not worth applying, why learn it? Out of curiosity? I'm a teacher of church history, okay? For many years, I thought that when he came to the Council of Nicaea, which is a very important time, I should get my students to know about all the different positions and who said what and why they said it and all that. And now I've come to realize that what's most important is not that. What's most important is that that student can go to the church and explain to them something that makes the doctrine of the Trinity relevant to their faith and their life and their work. And it's not important, it's not as important that the student knows all the theological, the system of ethical decisions and the systems of ethics, as that student knows how to help fellow believers make proper ethical decisions. Now, in its leadership development programs, as a result both of vision and commitment of its leaders and of necessity, the national plan has developed a holistic program of leadership development that includes the other 3 points I mentioned earlier, namely, accompanying annual conferences, developing new congregations, working on immigration and social issues. These are not different stages or 3 disparate concerns, but the very context, the very setting, and the very purpose in which the leadership education program, the leadership formation program takes place. Now, that general theme of leadership development allowed me to change my imagery. The president mixes his metaphors, so why can't I? Okay. Let me change my imagery and leave aside the matter of the stairway. I have said elsewhere that some 40 years ago, some of us began working, trying to promote Latinas and Latinos in theological formation. We talked about a pipeline. And we talked about how we had to develop this pipeline that led from high school to college, to seminary, to graduate school, so we could really impact theological education. Now, don't misunderstand me. I still think that it's important to have our people in all of those means, situations, and levels of theological education. But I no longer think that a pipeline imagery is adequate. A pipeline is intended to carry its contents, whether oil or water or whatever, in this case, prospective leaders, to carry them from one place to the next. And when applied to issues of leadership formation, a pipeline implies that the purpose of that formation or when you talk about formal theological education, the purpose of that is to carry students from one level to the next with as little leakage as possible, with as little contamination as possible. Taken to an extreme, it would seem to imply that the greatest measure of a seminary success is how many of their students go on to graduate work. And the greatest measure of a graduate program is how famous their doctors become. Now that may be very true in education at large. That's the way education is organized. But Christian theological education, Christian theological education, Christian education that's shaped by the Christian faith, by the gospel, is all about that very strange man who said, "It is not so among you," and who made it clear that no matter what politicians might say, you do not become great by having power over others, but by serving others. Now, this is to suggest that better than a pipeline, we should think about the entire enterprise of leadership formation as a drip line irrigation hose. That hose carries water the same way as the pipe. But while the success of the pipe is measured by what comes out at the end, the success of the irrigation hose is measured by how well it irrigates the land through which it traverses. Certainly some of the water has to get to the end, because otherwise the land out there wouldn't be watered, wouldn't be irrigated. But that water that gets to the end is no more valuable, is no more successful, is no better than the first drop that dripped out at the very, very first hole. Indeed, if there's no seepage, if all the holes in the hose get covered, what comes out at the end is a gush that destroys the field rather than help it. Now, why is this important? It is important because if we are to respond adequately to that communication gap that threatens the very future of the church, we must develop a leadership and a style of leadership development that knows and believes two things at the same time. First, that we must learn all we can about the Bible and theology and history and ethics and preaching and all that. All that is important. But secondly, that our task is to communicate these things to the church at large in such a way that they become significant, relevant, and that lead to having a common vision and a common hope. It will be that common vision and that common hope that will help us to exorcise from the church and from our society the present demons of hatred, division, bigotry, oppression, sacralized injustice, idolatric nationalism. But back to the future. I spoke at the beginning of a future that I fear and a future of which I hope. Perhaps in speaking about that, I gave the impression that we have to look at those two futures with an equal dose of hope and fear. And if I did so, I misspoke. In my moments of deeper faith, when I ground my life in the promises of God, I know that the future for which I hope will come to pass. So what fear remains is not fear for God's future, but rather fear for the future of the United Methodist Church, which I love and which has formed me. It is not fear for the church of God, against which the gates of hell will never stand. It is fear for this United Methodist Church, assailed and infiltrated as it is by demons of bigotry and hatred and division and privatizing faith. That too is demonic. It is fear that we will not be able to come together as a pre-enactment, a foretaste, a little taste of that glorious day when they shall come from the east and the west and from the north and the south and sit together at the table of the Lord. It is fear that we will not realize that in this apparently mixed up world of ours, that we will not realize that that very mix, God has given us a glimpse of that vision of John to which I referred earlier, of a great multitude of people that no one could count, of all nations and tribes and languages, all together singing praises to the Lamb. But it is also a fear that is overcome by the unshakable hope by which we know, if we are Christian, we know that somehow, someday, somehow, someday, they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their pruning hooks into whatever. That we should not spend our resources in swords and rockets, but the universal health coverage. That somehow, someday, we shall sit under our own fig tree, not harvesting and being poisoned in other people's vineyards. That someday, somehow, no matter whether we have papers or not, no one shall make me afraid. It isn't that someday that somehow God will bring about that our hope lies. It is out of that someday that we are called to live this day. It is our hope, the hope that we cry out daily, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So be it. Amen. Thank you. Thank you so much.